Today's digitalized information environment has given rise to various actors who use information manipulation to undermine trust in public institutions, deepen polarization, and gain geopolitical influence. The NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, based in Riga, Latvia, works to combine knowledge from private, public, and academic sectors to equip allies and partners with up-to-date digital environment analysis, research, and training. As part of our effort to provide a practical knowledge base to those working in strategic communications, we have launched a new podcast where I will be interviewing experts, practitioners, and decision makers in the field. My name is Tomass Pildegovičs, and I'm currently a researcher at Cambridge University. And to discuss all of these complex issues, I'm proud to say that our first guest is Professor Neville Bolt. Professor Bolt has stepped foot in both the worlds of academia and policy. He currently serves as the director of the Center of Strategic Communications at King's College London, and he is the editor-in-chief of the academic journal Defense Strategic Communications. Professor, thank you for joining us. So in recent years, strategic communications has become a very fashionable term to use. But amidst this conceptual jungle, it can be very easy to use, misuse, even abuse the same term with very different understandings or interpretations of it. So I would like to begin our conversation today by attempting to reverse engineer the term to understand how it has come to be used so widely. So perhaps we could start with an ambitious overarching question: what is strategic communications and what makes it different?
Let's start by differentiating between different types of strategic communications. So let's talk today about politics and geopolitics. Let's not talk about corporate or commercial strategic communications where it's understood slightly differently. So in the commercial sector, strategic communications is really about internal communications within an organization in order to get the message or the understanding of what the purpose of the organization is all about from the top to the bottom, but also to communicate what the organization or indeed what its products might be to the consumer public. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about politics and geopolitics. And so it becomes more diffuse, some would say even more ambiguous, because politics is very difficult to get your hands around. Strategic communications in the political and geopolitical sphere is about the long-term shaping and shifting of significant discourses in society. So it's playing out the big conversations at the top level. So in terms of politics, I would say it's not about local politics. So it's not about fixing the holes in the street outside your house, unless they suddenly become geopolitically significant, those holes. But we're talking about major ideas that evolve over the long term. So therein already there's a tension between long term and short term. So there's a kind of consensus that's emerging around what is strategic communications. And that consensus says, well, if we're talking in a state context, then we're talking about how states interact with other states, or how states interact with non-states or sub-state actors, insurgent or terror movements, or transnational movements even. So Black Lives Matter might be one example of that. But it's really in a statist understanding of strategic communications, we're talking about projecting foreign and security policies to targeted, identified audiences in order to create a strategic effect. And that effect is to change the behavior, to change the thinking of those identified audiences using all the assets of the state, using all forms of communication. And I think it's important to remind ourselves that everything that relates to human beings can be read, can be interpreted as a kind of text. So Here we're talking about, in the world of strategic communications, projecting foreign policy and security policy through words, but far more important, I think, in this day and age, images. And you might say, even more important than that, what people do, their actions. And also, when they choose not to do something, also sends out a message, sends out a meaning. Human beings look at something and they attach meaning to what they're seeing. And so strategic communications is trying to achieve a change, and it's in the thinking and it's in the behavior of audiences that you've identified. And then politicians would probably say, you're doing that in the national interest. So that's a kind of, in there somewhere, you will find some kind of consensus. Most people will come together and recognize that as a way of trying to understand strategic communications. Others will say, well, let's put it in a different way. That's a kind of way of operationalizing, putting into practice strategic communications, that kind of definition. Others would say, let's just look at the essence of it, the substance of it. What makes it tick? Where's the beating heart of it? Not how do you do it, but what is it? And they would say, well, it's a holistic activity, but it's rooted in a value system and also in interests. If you're a state, you have national interests. But this idea of values is very important. But of course, as soon as you start talking about values, you invite lots of different problems.
Perhaps to follow up on this point about the beating heart of strategic communications, or the kind of the substantive core, if we say that strategic communications as an academic field, it's quite recent, it exists maybe 25 years or so. Did strategic communications, however, exist before its emergence as an academic field? So would you say that was there strategic communications before strategic communications?
This is a big question. And in an academic context, not in a practitioner context, because as far as practitioners are concerned, maybe it doesn't even matter, that question. It's not significant. What matters is, what are we doing now? And how are we doing it? And are we doing it the best possible way? In an academic context, you're always looking for chronology, or even better, a critical genealogy. Where did we come from? How do we get here? What drove us forward? So are there similarities? The honest answer is, if you look at it with the label of strategic communications, and you've said, look, this field is an academic field, is no older than 25 years. It's probably even less than that. Insufficient research has been done on how people communicated 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Are there similarities? Yes, there are similarities. Are they exactly the same? Well, the answer there has to be, well, first we have to look at the context. Are we comparing the context of 2,000 years ago in a particular place with the context of today in Europe, for example? Are we comparing apples with bananas? When actually, if we are, then we're getting a false comparison. But are there certain approaches, certain understandings that are similar? So, for example, one way of looking at strategic communications, and certainly I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, certain governments and also NATO have tended to talk about, well, let's apply different lenses. Should we say that strategic communications is a mindset? It's a way of understanding the world. It's a way of understanding the world, particularly influenced by technology, and particularly post-1980s digital technologies. So mindset says we now live in a digitally interconnected world. It's just a complete, enormous plate of spaghetti junctions of feedback loops, and that you can never escape it. Everything, all human life takes place inside these media feedback loops. And they're on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can switch off your phone, but everything carries on around you, even while you're asleep, until you switch your phone on again, and then you're back in the middle of it. But you can't escape it. That's the point. So it's a mindset that says not that communications technologies exist inside the world of politics. It reverses it. It says all politics takes place within a world of information and communications. So that's one way of looking at it, mindset. Another way that people look at it is process. So you can see you're already starting to move in the perspective that you take to, when you talk about process, often that's organizations looking at themselves. So imagine a government, which is made up of different government departments, where ultimately that government wishes to speak with one voice. How do you harmonize the interests, and often competing interests, of different government departments, which is healthy in a democracy? We want checks and balances within a government. How do you harmonize that so that a government speaks with one voice? Then there's a third way of looking at it, which is strategic communications really just a box of tricks? Is it a box of techniques? And the more money you've got, the better people you can hire. The more money you've got, the longer you can test your audiences with particular techniques. I favor the first, that it's a mindset, it's a way of understanding the world that we're living in. But of course, there are clearly elements of process and elements of technique or tools that are involved in that, in the delivery of that.
Thank you. So you've offered several kind of framings or understandings of strategic communications, and I think that the practitioners in our audience would be interested in exploring these with respect to several maybe controversies or mistakes or blunders that have been made. But perhaps one final kind of question that I would like to ask in terms of establishing the theoretical foundations for our discussion is, with these different interpretations, so where does that lead us? Why do we need strategic communications? Why does it even exist?
Why does it exist is wrapped up in how does it come into being. The why and the how come together, no? Because ideas can live 1,000 years, but the extent to which they come to the fore, the extent to which they're foregrounded in our public awareness, depends on context. And that context changes over time. So even though it's a short history, I think it's quite a long story of why strategic communications comes into existence with this label of strategic communications. And let's just remind ourselves that strategic communications is not the same as communicating strategically.
Could you explain what you mean by that?
So every human being, I believe, communicates strategically and tactically. Every human being. In our daily lives, that's what we're doing. And a newborn baby very quickly learns how to get a cause and a response from a parent, from an adult, whether it smiles, whether it cries. It evokes a response. It learns that response. And the way it behaves can be the tactics, the stepping stones towards the end that it wants to achieve. It cries.
A child who cries to get parents' attention is communicating strategically.
Yeah. But that's not strategic communications.
Yeah.
That's communicating strategically. So strategic communications becomes a thing in itself. It's the sum is greater than just adding all the parts together. Where does it come from? Well, in a political and geopolitical sense, I first start to see it in the writing inside the United Nations in 1997, in a report that's commissioned under Kofi Annan. And Kofi Annan, as General Secretary of the United Nations, replaces Boutros Ghali. Slightly controversial figure. And what they're reflecting on is really how the world has changed since the Cold War. How as soon as with the fall of the Soviet Union and a change in the pattern of the relationship between peace and war. The number of insurrections, insurgencies, proxy wars, the merging very explicitly of state activity with criminal activity, particularly in the Balkans and so on. The United Nations is caught at a moment when it is optimistic about its role politically, geopolitically. The United Nations can now assert itself as a major force for consensus building and the projection of values. But there's a problem. There's a problem. The United Nations, with all its optimism, suddenly finds itself ill-equipped to deal with this changing world. Ill-equipped to deal with it internally because its own information gathering and reporting to the outside world, explaining to the outside world, its own internal structures are not fit for purpose. And then secondly, it recognizes that it doesn't know how to speak its values because the United Nations feels that it is rooted in a set of liberal universalist values. It is unable to speak. It can't persuade people, and it's actually losing the trust of populations around the world. And this is fueled by particular failures. Bosnia, Rwanda, Somalia, and these are nothing short of disasters for the United Nations. So by 1997, Kofi Annan arrives and says, why are we failing? Let's try and sort this out. A report is commissioned, and the report says, first, we've got to sort out ourselves. We need to be better strategic communicators. And that involves identifying constituencies, communities around the world that we need to speak to, with whom we need to communicate on a one-to-one level almost, in a relationship of mutual respect, so that they understand what we actually represent and how we can move forward from that. Then something happens, which is 9/11. And the George Bush administration is wrong-footed by events. It is shocked psychologically, and you hear conversations emerging around how is it that a small group of terrorists, insurgents, militant Islamic insurgents, how can such a small group have such a devastating effect, not only on the psychology of the United States, but on the whole world? Such a simple act, such a simple performance act. How does that resonate symbolically with so many communities in the world and bring out that latent or implicit distrust that people have of the United States? And the United States is shocked by it. And then what you find, as the US and ISAF and NATO forces eventually move into Afghanistan, into Iraq, then what you find is a conversation that starts to develop around how do we communicate better?
So I would like to actually ask you about the events that would follow Afghanistan and Iraq, because I think that it's maybe useful to guide our conversation in the direction that allows us to explore what is even at stake. What is the cost of what happens if strategic communications is done poorly? And I think maybe the most useful and obvious example to consider in this context would be the war in Afghanistan and the controversial US withdrawal last year. In fact, could we not say that Afghanistan and Iraq have been the biggest tests for Stratcom over the past decades? So maybe to formulate my question or this part of the discussion in full, you mentioned that strategic communications define itself by the long term, not the short term. And this, in my mind, raises the obvious question of how do we explain then the fact that in Afghanistan we managed to go through so many iterations, through so many stories of first wanting to go in and find the terrorists responsible, capture them or kill them in line with international law, to in the end attempting to build a new inclusive democratic state in in Central Asia or in the Middle East region. Isn't this the opposite of strategic communications?
Yes. Yes, in short it is. And we're all wise with the benefit of hindsight. There's no rule book. And I would hope, and I do believe, that we learn better from our failures than we do from our successes. Afghanistan is a failure, I would argue, in strategic communications because fundamentally the ground shifted, the story changed, the justification for being there changed repeatedly. It went through many iterations. And 20 years seems a long time, but when you end up trying to tell a story of the West is in Afghanistan to build a liberal, democratic, capitalist, modern state, without actually understanding the ingredients in the country, without understanding the culture of the country, and you try to do that in 20 years, well, it's an impossibility. Maybe it's possible in 200 years. And maybe the Roman Empire understood that. If you're going to change things significantly, radically, and I mean root and branch change from the grassroots, if you believe that's right, and I suppose if you have the consensus of the people.
But 200 years is quite the time horizon for policy planners. I'm not sure we would have signed up for that.
No, not unless you're Chinese, of course. And the Chinese state probably does think in terms of 200 years. There are very interesting conversations that are recorded with Chinese leaders, thinking back to Deng Xiaoping and visiting presidents, prime ministers, heads of state from Europe, wanting to do trade deals, wanting to get closer to the Chinese state, and being told, that's all very interesting. Why don't we continue this conversation in 50 years' time, or come back in 100 years' time? But yeah, we're interested, but come back in 100 years' time.
Patience is a virtue.
Patience, strategic patience. In the case of Afghanistan, there wasn't the commitment to stick around for 200 years. You can see in the hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 that 20 years was enough for the Americans, who were essentially funding that project. The difficulty, I mean, that's one way of looking at it, is the timescale, the long term, as you say, the long term. Strategic communications has to work in the long term in terms of changing the way people think and changing the way people behave. But it was the rapidity of change, the number of changes in the story of Afghanistan, and the story, not just that that those Western states were telling to the people of Afghanistan, but it's the change in the number of stories that Western states were telling to their own populations in answer to why we're there. I mean, you have to be able to answer that question. Why are we there? Mm-hmm. Especially if you're sticking around for 20 years or 200 years.
And who do you think is primarily culpable for this message creep? Do you think this is squarely at the hands of the politicians, or is there some sort of nefarious deep state who is in charge of perpetuating these shifting justifications? Is this the media? Is this diplomats? Is this the military-industrial complex? Who would you say, who is culpable for this primarily?
All of those you've mentioned have a reason to sit at the table. And they all have often different agendas, albeit often overlapping agendas too. Did military planners or their generals overpromise at the beginning? It depends, I suppose, what they were asked to do. Did they have a strategic endpoint? And did they have an exit route? That's one set of questions. Another is, in response to these different communities that you've identified, was there clarity of thought on the part of politicians, Western democratic politicians? I would say no. Is that because they lacked a strategic understanding? Yes, probably, possibly. But also, we just have to always remind ourselves that democratic politicians are up for re-election every 4 or 5 years. And the people who are electing them don't want to necessarily understand all the detailed complexity of why something is not working. So democratic politicians tend to think in short term. There's a problem there because they want short-term results, because the money that is being expended is taxpayers' money also. So politicians are being called to account when they put themselves, at least when they put themselves up for re-election. So their short-termist thinking is built into the system. Journalists, and I'm a former journalist, so I'm as guilty as the next, tend to go where the story is hottest. And they also demand instant results. On the one hand, yes, they're very intelligent people, journalists, I hope, and are understanding, but still, they want answers. They want answers now. And answers don't always come very readily. So going back to your message creep in Afghanistan, well, the message creep follows the mission creep in Afghanistan. So initially, forces are dispatched to Afghanistan to track down those who perpetrated the horrors of 9/11, a small group of people, and Osama bin Laden as part of Al-Qaeda. And very quickly, it is learnt that those fighters, those Islamic fighters, as they see themselves, as a political insurgent movement, as they would define themselves, seek the hospitality of different groups, particularly Pashtun groups with a very particular honor code in Afghanistan, networks of what we would consider to be conservative, culturally conservative people who have a very deep honor code, which is if somebody is your guest, you protect them. Mm-hmm. And so very quickly, Al-Qaeda started to map onto the Afghan Taliban. So essentially, those forces were now having to redirect their attention also at militant Taliban who started to become more aggressive, more antagonistic towards foreign invaders, whom they could, and Al-Qaeda could very simply identify as Christian invaders whose intent was to destroy Islam and its population and its worshippers. And that very quickly, because you're becoming involved with Pashtun people, but other ethnic groups in Afghanistan, very quickly that evolves into how do you combat them in order to get at the Al-Qaeda people? And in order to break into that relationship, it requires, how should I put it, a more ethnographic, anthropological understanding of the people, which then leads you very quickly into understanding what is the relationship between Taliban and the populations economically as well as socially. Economically, therefore, what you're trying to do, as counterinsurgency thinking is then introduced, not just simple counterterrorism. Counterterrorism is let's hunt down the killers and let's either catch them or kill them. Counterinsurgency says let's separate the bad people from the good people in society and let's try and encourage those who share good values
to build their resilience.
To build their internal resilience. And how do we do that? By giving them essentially aid and development. So how do we build hospitals for them? How do we build clinics? How do we build schools? How do we build bridges? How do we create, very quickly now we're shifting into how do you create capitalist marketplaces? And then very quickly,
the scope of the mission
it's starting to grow.
Ballooning.
And then we start to engage with we know that one of the biggest drivers of the Afghan economy is the opium and heroin trade. So 1 year, troops are sent in to destroy the poppy fields. And for a while, there was a discussion, maybe Afghanistan should be exporting pomegranate juice to the West. But also, what's realized very quickly is pomegranate juice doesn't make as much money either for the dealers, the shippers, even the people who are operating on the streets of European cities and North American cities, and not even for the producers, the farmers in Afghanistan. You make more money out of producing poppies than you do out of producing pomegranate trees. And so, having destroyed the poppy crop 1 year, next year the poppy crop is allowed to grow again. And so it grows. And so we very quickly move into
So there
women's
were
rights.
different attempts to prop up these industries, right?
Well, what's happening
the
is
silk industry, I think.
there's an economic, exactly, there's an economic way of then starting to look at this problem as it's become. But remember, this is still driven within a military context, and this is not what military don't do aid and development. That's not what they are educated to do, trained to do. And especially when we start then to move into those very difficult areas in a very conservative country like Afghanistan of women's rights. How are we going to create education and equality of opportunity and equality of employment for women in Afghanistan, which hasn't been there before? And it depends where you are. We're not always talking about, remember, we're not talking about Kabul, because 80% of the country is actually outside the capital. And then the next step is we move towards democratic elections. Democracy in a country where if you go to the village and hold a democratic election, everybody in the village votes the way the village leader tells them to vote. Now, that's not democracy in our understanding of democracy. So you can see what's happening is that the mission is changing all the time, and the way we try to explain that mission is changing all the time in a very responsive, reactive way. You would say, this is just a set of tactics, and tactics that keep going wrong or updating themselves. Yeah. And yet you're trying to say to me, strategic communications is long-term. Absolutely, you're right. There should be a long-term objective. You know what you're getting yourself into. You know what you're moving towards. And you operate patiently, and you know that it's going to go wrong on the way repeatedly, but you move towards your objective. Clearly, in the case of Afghanistan, after 20 years, the decision was made to pull all the troops out. And also aid and development has since suffered, as you know, because there's all kinds of shortages and famine now in Afghanistan. That's a very long answer to your short question.
No. Thank you for this. But so just to summarize this, while strategic communications is not some sort of silver bullet that would have helped dramatically alter or consolidate, let's say, gains on the ground and so on, adopting a strategic communications mindset from the outset would have helped avoid some of the costs and mistakes associated with short-term thinking and seeking short-term political gains that politicians could sell.
I think so. I agree with you. And I think in strategic communications, we try, and this is not necessarily a military definition of strategy, but I would say it's a communicator's understanding of what is strategy. And strategy is not the same as a plan, I would argue. The plan is what you and I do in the office and in this idealized world that we have, and we create the perfect plan, and it looks beautiful, and we think, we've thought of all the negatives, and we've built them in, and we've thought of what are the contingencies for that? How do we deal with the problems that we can imagine are going to come up? And then we say, good, let's go do it. And we step outside the room, and suddenly we're hit by the cold blast of real life. And that, I believe, is when strategy comes in. Strategy is about maneuver. It's about maneuver, it's about navigation, it's about negotiation. And you know, in communications, we talk about the environment as being a contested, a fast-moving, a dynamic environment, but with lots of voices, thousands, millions of voices that are trying to, that are drowning you out, your voice out, Some of them want to drown your voice out. The others don't even know you exist. They're just speaking louder than you are. And somehow you have got to be heard by the people you want to talk to. And somehow you've got to find your way through this minefield of competition, of contesting voices to get to where you set out your kind of planned objective. Mm-hmm. So it was Professor Rosa Brooks who said to Congress back in 2010 in the United States, and she was asked, why is it so difficult? And she just said, look, strategic communications is hard because it's hard. And she said, it's aspirational. We're not trying to reflect something that's happening. We're trying to move towards new norms, new, better ways of living our lives. I mean, I suppose strategic communicators in the West, certainly, are trying to go to the essence of what is politics. And this may sound like a pocketbook Aristotle, but politics really, I suppose, is about offering people a better life than the one they already have. And so there's a value judgment being placed there as well. What is better? Who gets to say what is better?
Well, you have Aristotle. Maybe I can offer you a quote from somebody with whose work I'm more familiar with, and that would be the boxer Mike Tyson, who has the famous quote, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Absolutely.
So I think that also shows the difference between tactic and strategy, and where strategic communications has a role.
I think Aristotle and Mike Tyson would have had a very interesting conversation, I think.
I think so too.
I think they would have seen eye to eye.
So perhaps we can move on from Afghanistan and that whole mess, and we could briefly discuss strategic communications in a more global context, maybe look at some distinctions between Western and non-Western approaches. And if we trace back to our earlier segment where we tried to define strategic communications and understand what criteria comprise it, you mentioned this values dimension as being important. And that's the role of values and interests actually is also key in the definition used by the Stratcom Center of Excellence and other NATO institutions. So about values, in your view, does that make strategic communications a Western, liberal, democratic construct? Or is strategic communications a purely technical term, meaning that it can be adopted by anyone from North Korea to Amnesty International? Is it inherently a Western concept, or can anybody wear the badge of, I am doing strategic communications?
The most pertinent question, the most difficult question, and a question that very few people really face up to. So you're going right to the heart of the issue, really. So you're right, NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga, Latvia, its terminology working group, but beyond that, across NATO, there is a clear belief that NATO's whole essence is that its existence is rooted in a set of values: respect for law, international law, respect for the individual, respect for universal rights, not particular rights, respect for defending, preserving the security of populations, particularly of its member state populations. So values sits right at the heart of it. So here's the problem, as you've identified. Are we saying that strategic communications is something that anybody can do? Let's talk here just about states, and maybe include in that sub-state actors or trans-state actors, like we've mentioned Al-Qaeda and ISIS and so on. Are we saying it's something that anybody can do? If that's the case, going back to our where we started out earlier, where we talked about mindset, process, tools or techniques, are we saying then really that strategic communications is really a set of techniques that anyone can use? If you get good at it, you can communicate better. Is that really what it is? But that doesn't have anything to do with values. That's purely an operational and a way of instrumentalizing what it is that you do. If you're looking for something of a much higher order that says, no, what we do must always be consistent with our set of values, then I think it opens the whole debate around strategic communications. It opens it right up. Because certainly in the West, implicit and sometimes explicit in talk around values and interests, certainly when we talk about values, we're talking about democratic values. This is the assumption on the part of many Westerners who, when they say, these are my values, they're referring to liberal democratic values.
But why exactly does the West get to claim the mantle of values here? Iran, Russia, China, they could claim that they're doing exactly the same thing. They're also mobilizing these resources and attempting to change long-term discourse with respect to their values. They also have values. So yes. Could you outline this distinction more?
So again, if everybody says they have values, and I think they do, the difference, I suppose, is that the degree to which they are consistent with the essence of what we think strategic communications is. So strategic communications, when we're talking about shifting and shaping long-term discourses in societies, we're talking about discourses, and we're talking about shifting and shaping not through the use of force, not through coercive means, although coercion is always somewhere the elephant in the room, of course it is. We're talking about persuasion. And at the heart of democracy is persuasion, conversation, the creation of discourse between equals. You may say, well, that's not the way it really works out, but in principle, that's what I hope we all aspire to. When we look at the other states who are claiming, who might claim, they don't necessarily actually want to use the term strategic communications at the moment. They're not necessarily committed to creating conversations out of consensus. They're committed to creating conversations out of diktat, command and control, driven from the top, say in China, from a communist, Chinese Communist Party hierarchy that is interwoven with the People's Liberation Army, who were very command and control. Their values are different kind of values. Their values, let's say in China, appear to be based on collectivism, not respect for the individual, but respect for the community, the collective, respect for long-term harmony, which kind of grows out of a Confucianist understanding of how society should function. But there's a political understanding in China as well, which is, and that has come very, very explicitly from President Xi, certainly in the last 7 or 8 years, where he has directly attacked democracy and said it's not fit for purpose. You cannot run a complex post-industrial world society using democracy, using democratic governance. Well, I would beg to differ. I believe in democracy. It may not be perfect, but it's better than the alternative. For me, it's better than authoritarianism or totalitarianism that is represented by Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, those authoritarians and totalitarians. I don't want to see my grandchildren grow up in societies like that. Mm-hmm. Democracy, for all its weaknesses, still is infinitely preferable to those. And at the heart of democracy has to be a conversation between the members of that democratic state. So does China have values? Of course it does. Of course it has values. Does it have interests? Absolutely it has interests. I just don't happen to share them. And I don't think that strategic communicators, and you're right in saying strategic communications is a Western construct. Absolutely, it's a construct. It came out of the West. Mm-hmm. And it came out of Western liberal thinking, hence United Nations, NATO, and Western democratic states evolved, shaped this way of thinking. I think it's fair to say that Russia says we don't need the term strategic communications. We're doing it anyway. This is quite a complicated debate. China says we don't really need it. We're doing it anyway. Except China has actually invested a lot of thinking into what the West is doing. So it's an interesting case to look at because President Xi last May, I think it was, used the term, he spoke the term strategic communications for the first time, although he talked about strategic communications with Chinese characteristics, because that with Chinese characteristics appears to always be the suffix, the thing that's added on to the end of the sentence, fine. So China has values, it has interests, it does propaganda. This is really important to understand, really important. Because we say, you do propaganda. They say, we do propaganda. We mean by propaganda, the average person on the street in the West means propaganda is when politicians manipulate and tell lies and attempt to effectively con the elector, the populace, to serve their own ends. In the Western academic understanding of propaganda, there are very different understandings. It's really important, but we don't want to get into an academic debate, but just to say that what the ordinary person on the street reads as propaganda is not exactly the way some academics read it, some Western academics read it. It has a much richer understanding. So, for example...
So it's not necessarily a double standard.
It's not necessarily telling lies. So when Western politicians look at China, for example, they say, you're telling lies. In the academic understanding of propaganda, it's not quite that. At least the lie has a kernel of truth in it. It has a seed of truth, always, otherwise it can't be persuasive. Other academics would argue, well, it's not just being imposed on a population by a small elite, this lies with a seed of truth, it's a co-production. That the population also participates in that propagandist activity. Set that to one side for a minute. China officially teaches at universities propaganda studies. For them, this is a technocratic, neutral term. It is information and communication studies. What we would call information and communication studies, they call propaganda studies. So for them, it is a perfectly respectable thing to talk about. However, within that understanding is a decision-making process, a command and control process that makes propaganda subservient to the interests of the ruling elite in Chinese society. So it's very top-down, although it is seen as a very valid subject to study. However, once President Xi started to talk about strategic communications with Chinese characteristics, he has to then say, well, hang on a second, propaganda is not the same as strategic communications. It's not the same. We're going to stick to propaganda, as we understand it, inside China. with the domestic population. But because all these Western governments are talking about strategic communications in foreign policy and their security policy, we need to engage with them in the same conversation. So China can at least start to talk about the use of strategic communications in its foreign and security policy. So in its external relations, at least it's opening the door to maybe we can talk about strategic communications as a way that we conduct our business with you in the West. But inside China, we're going to stick to propaganda. So you can see how quickly it kind of gets complicated and quite murky and grey.
But so I'm not a spy or an intelligence operative.
No?
So, I mean, I have no kind of way of knowing what is really being discussed at the top levels of the Chinese Communist Party or so on. But perhaps you could shed some light on how China's reacting to the way the West has done strategic communications. What has been kind of the thinking among Chinese scholars or researchers? Is China concerned by the West becoming maybe more adept at incorporating a strategic communications mindset in its different operations? Is there thinking that the West has some new weapon, some new tool at its disposal, or is there really not much concern about this?
Well, I think there's interest. I'm not sure whether there's concern. There's certainly interest by a lot of non-democratic states in the world. Because as you say, is this a magic bullet that the West has suddenly discovered? Or is it a magic key that opens a door to a new understanding? And certainly if you look at Chinese scholarship, if you look at what Chinese academics, a small number of Chinese academics have been writing since around 2007, if you look at what they're saying to each other, because none of it's translated into English, so if you read it in the original, they're trying to, and they're doing a very good job, actually, in the last 15 years, of observing what the West thinks strategic communications is all about, and how it's developing its understanding, both theoretical and practical, of that field, of that emerging field. Of course, all Chinese scholarly debate, even though it's published in journals, which very few people read, still takes place within a very constrained political prescription, what you're allowed to say, what you're not, how far you can go, or who is actually, which political figure is talking through you, the academic, who's protecting your back, allowing you to say these things, who's planting these ideas into the elite discourse. So, Chinese scholars have been watching what Western theoreticians, academics, policymakers, practitioners have been doing with this thing called strategic communication. They've been looking at that for about 15 years. Does that affect them in terms of, is it changing their behavior? So far, no. Although you might question to what degree something like the Belt and Road Initiative either comes out of a Chinese reading of the world, forget strategic communications, just comes out of a purely Chinese reading of how to make China greater as a regional Asia-Pacific hegemonic power, or even ultimately as a global hegemon. If that were to be their ambition, we're not quite sure. In that context, Belt and Road Initiative could be something just 100% very Chinese, or it could actually be looking at probably, if not the greatest, one of the greatest strategic communications projects in Western history, which would be the Marshall Plan, following the Second World War, and how it was trying to do different things within the same concept. One, Europe was devastated by the effects of the Second World War. Its economies were completely destroyed. Its housing was destroyed. Its populations were migrating all over the place. There was famine, there was illness, disease. It was a complete mess, but at the same time, there was also the fear that the Soviet Union would push west and eventually swallow up, through both democratic means, through democratic elections, Communist Party popularity, Western Communist Party popularity.
In Italy or in Greece or...
Exactly, France, and so on. And also through the use of force, tanks. There was the fear that Europe could go communist, and what was the effect on the future of democracy? And the Marshall Plan, I think, was a brilliant and a very, very courageous and committed move on the part of the United States. Out of self-interest? Yeah, but out of, I would hope, I believe, a belief in democratic governance and democratic freedoms. And the Marshall Plan invested vast amounts of money into Europe to allow it to rebuild its economies, but to rebuild them also within a liberal democratic, capitalist framework.
So I apologize if this is a bit of an uncomfortable question, but it almost seems like you've opened the door for this interpretation of almost the US conducting election interference to ensure kind of favorable outcomes, to ensure that, you know, pro-Western democratic forces would win in some of these rebuilding post-war European societies. Would you say this was the case? That I know that this has been an accusation leveled by, for example, the Russian government when accused of conducting election interference. It says, okay, this is a double standard. This is exactly what the West has done, mentioning, for example, these contexts. Would you say that there is any kind of double standard here?
I think in the case of the Marshall Plan, for example, and in the progress on the part of Western states in the area of aid and development, in the area of public diplomacy, and public diplomacy is, if you like, the persuasive, soft power aspect of strategic communications. I would say that something like the Marshall Plan only set a framework. Mm-hmm. It didn't intervene in specific elections. That wasn't what it was trying to do. It was trying to make Western democratic values attractive through investing money, through building economy, creating jobs, creating housing, creating futures for the next generations of Europeans. I would not apologize for that. If I was sitting in Washington, I would say this is a great benefit that we are offering to the world. Public diplomacy, and by public diplomacy, I mean cultural exchange, tourism exchange, educational, academic exchange, sporting event exchange, the Olympic Games or whatever it might be, trade, all these that we consider to be kind of soft power, using that very loosely, that term, all those things that advertise, in a sense, that show the underlying values or the benefits of the way that we see the world, or that, democratic states and people see the world, is an act of persuasion and attraction. I don't see anything wrong in that. Mm-hmm. And if Russia is suggesting that that is interference, I think that's a complete misreading on their part. It's not interference. If I try to do something that I think is beneficial for you, and I do that in all sincerity and honesty, and I'm straight with you, and you recognize that, and you're not stupid, you can analyze the reasons why I'm doing something. If you accept that, I think that's a partnership. Mm-hmm. I don't see that as interference, and certainly it's certainly not subverting other people's democratic elections. So I'm quite resistant to that.
Perhaps one final point before we conclude. We have kind of touched upon it several times, the role of strategic communications in relation to the current crisis of democracy that many would say we are experiencing at the moment. In fact, in a global context, these are not the brightest of times for democracy. There has been a kind of rollback across the world, and even within NATO, democracy and the rule of law have been, let's say, challenged in several member states. So there have been worrying developments. Against this backdrop, what role do you see for strategic communications in strengthening the resilience of our democratic societies, systems, and institutions?
If you see strategic communications, if you do, as being bound up with democratic principles, and ultimately about creating an inclusive forum for people from different countries, different cultural backgrounds, different national backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, to be able to engage with one another in a relationship of mutual respect, then I think strategic communications does have an important role to play in the future of peacemaking, peace building, peacekeeping, but also in terms of the spread of universal human values and civil rights. We always have to remind ourselves, I think you're right when you say that democracy, whatever that means, because there are many different forms of democracy practiced in the West, but democracy as we understand it, the respect for the individual and hopefully within a context of individual transparency of governance, access to the levers of power, and so on. Democracy as a form of governance is going through a period of self-questioning. I don't think that's necessarily bad. It's uncomfortable when you're part of it. It's very uncomfortable. It's quite frightening at times. But if democracy is about discussing values, questioning values, reappraising values, re-energizing those values, then it can only come about through a process of constant conversation. And I think we're going through that in a very heightened way. Is that being manipulated by malign forces, both within those democracies and outside those democracies, either separately or together? Yes. But there's the problem with democracy, always, no? Its strength is its weakness. If you have an open house, anybody can walk in, and they can mess up your furniture if they want to. But you have to be sufficiently strong and resilient, and your values that you believe in have to be sufficiently attractive and persuasive, basically for those malign influences to be rejected by the majority of people inside your house.
If I can touch on a pressure point, though, in this regard, surely, for example, the January 6th events in the US Capitol, those horrible scenes surely are not representative of some healthy self-reflection process, some sort of healthy conversation as part of a democratic process that allows us to understand in which way we want to move forward and how we want to build our society. Surely this sort of event is it's a very destabilizing moment.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. That's to put it mildly. And yes, it's destabilizing, but you can't take the event out of the context. And perhaps what's happening in the United States is there isn't sufficient conversation around what is true democracy. How do we include enough people to feel that they have a vested interest in their own futures and in the future of the state in its present form? And therefore, maybe what we're seeing is a kind of safety valve, that explosion of that insurrection, not desirable, very disconcerting, but maybe it's a safety valve that also reminds those in the political, economic elites of that country and other countries that a conversation needs to be had. We shouldn't assume that just because we're democracies that we are actively engaging in the right kind of conversations that satisfy the grievances, the desires, the ambitions of everybody in society. So maybe it's a reminder that we just need to get our act together and pursue the conversation.
I think on this optimistic note and an important reminder to never take these conversations for granted, I think we can wrap it up. Thank you so much for taking your time today. I think it was a lucid and informative conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.